Good morning, everyone, and welcome again to this week's Morning Coffee and a Thought, brought to you by Wings of Faith Ministries here in Sarnia, Ontario. Good to be with you. I hope you have your coffee. I have mine right here. This morning, I want to talk on the subject of building and teamwork. And I believe a wonderful example of this is in the Old Testament, a great Jewish hero, Governor Nehemiah, whose calling and ministry comes at 445 BCE under the Persian Empire. I think we can learn some lessons from Nehemiah and how he approached his calling and mission in life. And as we will see, some of these same points are brought up again in Paul's writings in the New Testament. So we'll get back to our thought in just a moment. First of all, I want to remind you that Morning Coffee and a Thought can be seen every Friday beginning at 1 p.m. on our YouTube channel and every Sunday morning at 8 a.m. on our Facebook page. Also on Wednesday mornings, we have a series called Journey of Insight, where Al and I are discussing the foundational truths of the Christian faith. We hope you will join us for that. Also, if you have a prayer request, if you want information, or you want to make a donation to the ministry, you can do all of that by reaching out to us at wingsoffaithministries.ca. Also, if you are a subscriber, and we thank you, all of those who have subscribed, on the comments below the videos on our YouTube channel, just let us know where you're from, and we'd really appreciate that. So now, let's get back to the thought. It's 445 BCE. As I said, in 550 BCE, the Persians under Cyrus became the dominant empire in the region. And the Persian Empire would last about 230 years. But we have Jews that kind of went up the ladder in the Persian Empire, names like Esther and Daniel. And the figure we're talking about today, the Jewish hero, Governor Nehemiah. So for a little bit of background, once the Persians came into power, minorities were allowed to return to their homelands. And the Jews took advantage of this, many of them, about 42,000, returning in 3 waves back to the city of Jerusalem and the area around it. Now, Jerusalem as a city was basically a city of rubble. But when those initial exiles came back home, their first mission was to rebuild the temple, which they did under the encouragement of Haggai and the prophet Zechariah, and they got that project finished in 516 BCE. But the city was still in rubble. So our story begins with a bunch of Jews who had returned to the Persian Empire capital of Susa. And there they met with Nehemiah, who had now risen to be King Xerxes' cupbearer. They told Nehemiah about the state of the city of Jerusalem, that it was basically a mess, and the sad story of the people living there, a very sparsely populated city, totally undefended and unprotected. After Nehemiah heard their report, the scriptures tell us that he fasted and prayed, and then worked up the courage to petition his master, King Xerxes. And so Nehemiah goes to Xerxes and asks permission to return to Jerusalem to undergo a project of rebuilding the walls. In other words, fortifying the city so that the city could be repopulated. Xerxes gives him permission and letters of endorsement to return to the city and allows him materials from the surrounding area to rebuild the walls. When Nehemiah arrives in 445, I'm sure it was an encouragement to the residents of Jerusalem. But not everybody was happy about it, especially the tribes surrounding Judah, the Samaritans, the Arabs, and the Ammonites. All of these tribes were adversaries of the Jews and were not happy that anyone would come to promote the welfare of those in Jerusalem. And so immediately we have adversaries. When Nehemiah arrives, he doesn't really share yet what his plans are. We are told first he went out at night, inspected the damage to the city. After noting it all, he then sits down with the nobles that are there, priests, Levites, higher class people of the city, and tells them of his vision, that he wants to rebuild the walls of the city and, in the course of time, repopulate it. Everyone is on board, and this is where I want to look at the thought this morning of how Nehemiah does it, how he builds these walls. First of all, Nehemiah is going to ask for volunteers from every walk of life. Whether you were a priest, a Levite, a politician, a farmer, a merchant, some type of laborer, Nehemiah wanted your help in rebuilding the walls. And so Nehemiah took people from all walks of life and conscripted them after they volunteered to work on the wall. Once amassing his laborers, he then divided the labor between all the people that were conscripted to build it. But not only did Nehemiah need people to build the wall, he also needed people to act as their defenders. And so some of the people were given swords, spears, and shields to protect them, because Nehemiah knew that their adversaries were not going to just sit back and watch them build this wall without trying to interfere in it. And so Nehemiah conscripts this labor force and a defensive force as they take on this massive project of rebuilding the wall. He divides sections of the wall among the laborers. And as I said, people from all walks of life put their heart and souls into rebuilding these walls. The task was done in a record 52 days, a tremendous, monumental feat by the Jewish people. And so in 52 days, Nehemiah completes his project. And although his adversaries tried to interfere by intimidation, interference, plotting, they were not able to stop the building of the wall. Nehemiah put his hand to the plow and saw that it was done. The wonderful thing about Nehemiah is not only did he stop there as governor of the city of Jerusalem and the province of Judah, he then went on to change the community itself. There was financial, social, and religious sin within the community. And now that the walls were built, along with repopulating the city of Jerusalem, Nehemiah set out to establish religious, social, and economic order in the community. Let's go forward a bit. In the New Testament, we see exactly the same type of ideas put forth by the Apostle Paul in both the letter to the Corinthians and the letter to the Ephesians. Paul will state in his letter to the Corinthians that in building the kingdom of God, and this is laid out in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, that everybody is needed. Everyone has gifts. Everyone has a role to play in the building of the kingdom of God and partnering with God in the building of that kingdom. Just like Nehemiah had said to his people back in 445 in Jerusalem. Secondly, Paul will lay out in his letter to the Ephesians that we have to be wary of our adversary. Just like Nehemiah had physical adversaries surrounding Judah that wanted to interfere and discourage the people from building the wall, so we too, in our life, have an adversary whose main purpose is to discourage and interfere in the building of the kingdom of God. And like Nehemiah, who armed people to defend the city, so Paul says we have to put on the full armor of God, being aware that we have an enemy whose sole purpose is to interfere in that building. Secondly, along with that proposition, Paul talks about sin in the community. This comes out again in 1 Corinthians, where Paul has to deal with sin that has come in to the community of the Corinthian church because of fallen human nature, dealing with communion, dealing with sexual sins, dealing with sins of different classes of people. All these things had to be dealt with in the Corinthian church. Sins that had come from the outside and worked their way into the community of believers. And that's exactly what Nehemiah had to deal with in the city of Jerusalem and the province of Judea when he arrived back in Jerusalem. Building and teamwork. There are three parts to it. Labor in its division and the fact that everyone has a role to play in the Christian community. Everyone has gifts that they can bring to the table in the building of the kingdom of God. Secondly, to be wary of our adversary. We have an adversary, and we must always be aware of his schemes and devices, just as Nehemiah was aware of what his enemies were all about. And thirdly, we must always be wary of sin, both in our lives and in the life of the community of the church. Building the kingdom of God, teamwork, lessons that we can learn from a great Jewish hero, Nehemiah, and the writings of the Apostle Paul. For the same things that were happening back in the days of 445 BCE in the Jewish community under Nehemiah were very true in the first century Christian church, and they're true today in 2025. Building and teamwork. That's what it takes to build in partnership with God, the kingdom of God. That's my thought for you this morning. Listen, enjoy your coffee, and we'll see you again next week.